party started very soon after I got married.
The pictures that I had, Charlie was there, Beth was there.
I'm sitting here with friends and I didn't know that
There was no Hanukkah party before Charlie and I and Karen were there?
Rusty
That's
was
the
there.
first time I had a picture of.
Wasn't Rusty there?
Okay. Next question. I asked my father recently if he knew where his parents met. He said he did not. Do any of you, because my brother Charles seemed to know, please.
Blind date. No.
Jack speaks, Leon disagrees.
Leon's right. A gentleman came into my grandfather's office when my mother was working as a secretary, though she had a college degree.
From Hunter College.
From Hunter College.
She seems to run into a family.
And it changed later. The reason she didn't become as a teacher, she said her voice was too weak to be a teacher. Raising the four of us, that cured that problem. And a gentleman came in and said, you know, I know somebody who you ought to meet. And they arranged a meeting.
That's a blind date.
That's a blind date.
Maybe in Philadelphia it's not.
It's a shit-up, okay?
That is what we call
What was it?
shit-up.
So what's a blind date then?
A blind date is I say to you,
Jewish and breathing. I know someone else is Jewish and breathing.
So, did they start in the house on Chestnut, or did they go somewhere else?
They lived in an apartment on the street called Marion Avenue. Marion Avenue was in Washington Heights.
no,
in the
what
Bronx.
nights across the river cut.
Wait, what
In the Bronx, but south of the bridge, just a little south of the bridge.
Marion Avenue.
They moved into the house, I think shortly
Just
after
after I
Benita
was
was born.
It was about 3 months ago.
And we lived there all the years until we were all married. We lived in that house until after we were all married.
And it's a funny thing, I was the last to leave the house, so I was the last to put out the garbage, the last to shovel the stuff.
And he still bears a grudge.
No, I don't bear a grudge.
So I brought this picture of the former Messiah Home for Orphans, which was built in 1908. Grandma was in the
1 year old.
Jacobean revival style, if I looked it up online. This was across the street from our house.
That's where Leon and Jack came from, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Two for the price of one.
And
Big basket.
evidently they sold it to the Salvation Army, who had a training college there. I used to play on the grounds and get chased regularly with my friends. Every Thanksgiving, they had a football game between that Salvation Army Officers Candidate School and some other one, which was somewhere else in the Bronx or wherever. And the building is now landmarked, and it's something to do with employment or something, I don't know. But this is what we lived, it was like living across the street.
And every Sunday morning, every
Friday, Shabbos afternoon.
Shabbos afternoon, maybe it was, the officers, trainees would gather out in front on Andrews Avenue, and had a band, and they would form, there were probably about 50, 60 guys and girls, and they would walk down and parade onto University Avenue playing On with Christian Soldier.
They would go around the
The
block.
same thing every week, the same.
And Leon and Jackie used to say, the boom booms are coming. Let us
Okay,
see.
so we all know how much my father likes to read or buy books and his love for music. And we have a question to ask if your parents were as avid readers, and was music a big part of your family's life growing up? Please, Uncle Jack.
My father went to Metropolitan Opera and heard Sean Yalpin
Once.
sing, at least once.
They don't know who
And he
that is.
also went to St. Patrick's to hear the singing. No praying, but he went to hear the singing, okay? And Grandma Florrie read the Saturday Evening Post religiously every Shabbos.
More important, we had at least 7 newspapers a day, different newspapers, coming to the house.
like my parents' house, where they went in a pile, or somebody read them?
No, like my husband has, thank you.
There
They
was
were
a very
read.
high pile of newspapers that had to be disposed of or read.
We gave them away during the war, they collected them.
Yeah.
Along with the excess fat from.
We had the Jewish Tug, the day, my father read that every day, the New York Times, then he would bring home the World Telegram, he'd bring home sometimes.
The Sun.
The Sun we get every day in the corner candy store.
And
They
the
get the
journal.
mirror every day in the candy
And on
store.
Sundays, we would get the Daily Mirror, the Sunday Mirror was the comics, and we get the Journal Packets, and we read the comics about the on the radio. And, so we had a lot of newspapers, yeah.
But they got,
And the New York Times.
And we got another Herald Tribune in school. Pass the mic, pass the mic.
We were in the newspaper all day. I don't think, can you hear me?
For the camera.
Oh.
It's not allowed to speak. It's just the camera. If there's ever talking, should talk into this. This is recording in the camera.
Grandma read books, she did read
Okay,
books.
so, again, my memory, my memory is that you guys had the first phone on your block?
No, that was in her house where she grew up.
Okay. What about television? Were you in her?
We were probably the last people in the whole neighborhood to get a television set, because we didn't get one until after I graduated college,
Why?
because they didn't want it.
They were very expensive.
Because they thought that Toddy would watch television and not do his schoolwork.
So I didn't do my schoolwork without the television.
But at that time, you have to remember, television was something very new and very small. And I remember when my friends got a television, their living room was darkened. They had chairs set up in rows, and people would walk into their apartment and watch whatever it was, stupid thing was on television at the time.
And it was in black and white.
And small. And there was
And my parents had
a store around the corner that sold TVs, and they had one in the window. And people would stand in front of the window and watch the TV, the little black and white, whatever it was.
I know it's hard to believe that you were deprived growing up, but I felt very deprived because on a cold night in February, when I had to walk Rusty down Andrews Avenue, I had to walk down this dark street, and all I could see was the glow of televisions in every damn building except my house.
But you have to also know that when we were kids, we had the radio. And we would listen to the radio, and they were children's programs, what, from 4 to 6, The Lone Ranger, what else?
The Green Hornet?
The Green Hornet, The Shadow.
The Shadow, Sunday.
Well, The Shadow wasn't for kids, but Tom, and
Tom
Gino,
Mix.
and The Lone Ranger.
Jack Benny.
And The Lone Ranger was a big problem because very often it was 3 episodes, and the last episode was on Friday after Shabbos, so we never knew how it ended.
But he always came back.
Yes, Tonto.
So you mentioned walking Rusty. You had multiple dogs, didn't you?
Well, Lassie was a Scotty. She never had to be walked. She was self-maintaining.
We had a big yard.
She had a big yard, and she was a small dog.
Okay.
Actually, it's a very interesting story about Lassie, and it tells a lot about your great-grandfather, because basically he adopted Lassie because he had gotten a Great Dane, and the Great Dane got kidnapped. The dog was named Mazel Tov. This was the expression my grandmother...
Father's not liking the story.
It was a big dog. It was a big dog. But it was kidnapped.
So we had, over the years, we had 4 dogs in the house. The first one was Mazel Tov. So how did they get the name? We were told that my father brought the dog home, and I told my mother, "You have a dog," and she said Mazel Tov. And that's how he got the name. It was a German Shepherd, and we had him for a while, and then someone opened the gate, and the dog escaped. We never saw him again. The second dog was a Cocker Spaniel named Rex. Remember Rexy? And somebody did steal that dog. Somebody, we think, stole that dog. Then we had a few years without a dog. Then we got Lassie, who somebody gave to my father because apparently we didn't know when we got it, but she apparently had a history of occasionally biting somebody. She wasn't the warmest dog. She wasn't so friendly to the children. She loved my father, and she loved my Uncle Doc. That's the 2 people she really loved. and Sam, your name for my uncle. And then one Sunday morning, I think it was maybe, Jack came into the house and said to me, "There's a dog." It was a Friday after, maybe it was a Friday after. "There's a dog in the backyard under the old gates that we have leaning against the house." So we went out, and there sure was a dog in the under this pile of fence, and he wouldn't come out. So we went in the house, and I got some chicken that was in the refrigerator. I brought it out, and the dog came out to eat, and it was a very nice, friendly dog. It was a good dog. So we fed it. We took care of it. It was nice. It looked like it had maybe been hit by a car because it had a grease spot on its body, but it wasn't in any way injured. So the next day, the dog was still there. So we were thinking about maybe we could keep it a little bit. So my mother said, "Tell you what, leave the gate open. If the dog stays, maybe we'll talk about it. But maybe she'll want to walk out and go home to where she came from." So we left the gate open, but the next day the dog was there again and again. So we started to feed her regularly, and then she stopped eating. She wouldn't come into the house, by the way. She would not walk. She wouldn't go in the house at all.
6 months.
So she slept outside. She stayed outside. And then one Friday, she stopped eating, and my mother thought maybe she was a sick dog. So we called the ASPCA. The guy came and looked at the dog and said, "This dog is not sick. It's a well dog. Keep her for another couple of days." Miracle of miracles, the next day she started to eat again. So then we decided that we would leave the gate open for about a month, and at the end of the month, if the dog was still around, we would get a license, and it would be our dog, and that's what happened. That's how we got Rusty, who was our final dog, and the best dog. A wonderful dog with the children, with the grandchildren. She was just a great dog, a really great, and smart. If you said the word walk, she was right there from any place she was in the house. So you had to spell it. If you heard her chain jingle, we had to spell it. If she heard her chain jingle, she came right over to the door. We should take her for a walk. But that was so it was a dog, and she was a wonderful dog. Everybody loved Rusty.
Okay,
You want to hear about the bites?
wait, we want to hear about the cars. You had cars, and you...
She was not a wonderful dog.
I like
He barked incessantly when anybody came to the door. Really went
Boyfriends.
crazy. He bit one of my dates. It just so happened that the boy's father was a scientist who worked at Rockefeller Institute, and he wanted the dog,
The brain.
the brain, to make sure that the dog wasn't rabied. That didn't happen. So no, I did not think it was a wonderful dog.
Well, I love that dog so much that when she bit people, I had to walk her down to the Bronx ASPCA where she was held in isolation for a week. And then I had to walk her back. Yeah, it was on Fulton Avenue, on the other side of railroad tracks.
Why did you have to do that?
Because you couldn't take dogs on buses back in those days. They didn't know from comfort dogs.
Didn't she get shots? Did they have shots back then?
Rabies. Did they have rabies shots for the people who got bit by the rabid dog? Not for the dog. The dog got the gas chamber. Okay.
I don't know. We had a dog. We fed it Gaines. My mother occasionally got from the butcher something called cheek, which is today considered a gourmet delicacy. But the butcher used to give it to her, and she'd stew it up and sometimes give it to the dog. Otherwise, the dog got Gaines dog meal, and with gravy sometimes if he was lucky.
Okay,
He never went to the vet. He never
I
got...
want to hear more about Grandpa than the dog. I completely appreciate this. Completely appreciate it. I hear that. Okay, so the next question has to do with cars.
Yeah.
Again, my memory, which you're all going to correct, is that Grandpa didn't drive because of some car accident he had as a child. Woohoo, one for Beth. So, okay, as an adult. So he... Okay, so nobody knows that except for you. But so...
I said, As a child, he lived in Piesk. They didn't have cars in Piesk.
Okay, when did he come to America?
1912.
Well, we don't know how old he was.
Between 12 and 18. Probably between 12 and 17. Somewhere between there. We didn't know exactly.
Did he speak English before he got here?
No.
Yiddish.
Do you think they had an English school in town?
I have no idea.
No.
Broad, no, they had a very...
Did he have an accent when he spoke?
Yes.
How would I know that?
He always had an accent, and he always said it was because of his yeshiva education that he didn't lose his accent, which is one of the reasons he didn't send us to Salanta.
So you always had cars, but you had a driver at least for some of it.
Yeah. He never drove a car, never drove a family car.
Harry?
Harry was yeah, right.
So he drove your grandfather, he drove him and taught my father how to ride a bike.
My father had an automobile accident in the mid-1920s,
Yes, I just said that. You weren't,
and he went through a windshield.
okay.
And he had some scars on his cheek that were always very sensitive. And that was one of the reasons he had to be shaved every morning in a barber shop, because the barber knew how to get around the scars. So my father had a very thick beard. And when his luxury in life was to be shaved every morning at the Terminal Barber Shop. There was one barber shop that he used to go to, and some guy from the mafia got wiped out in that barber shop, so he stopped going to that barber shop. He didn't like bullet holes in the tile.
Wait, no, so I've heard of Harry. Have your children heard of him?
Yeah, my father used to go to the automobile show during the Depression, and he had a Cadillac, and he traded it in for a Rolls Royce.
Okay.
And then the following year, he traded it in for a Duesenberg. Every year, he traded the car in for a new car.
Actually, he
But he didn't drive the car.
Of course not.
bought the Duesenberg from Murray's uncle, actually. How do you like that?
Which one?
One you don't know.
The one who went broke.
Yes.
Okay, so the guy who drove,
So
did he live with you?
Harry was the chauffeur, quote, handyman, goat gardener. He did all that stuff.
And he was with you till when?
43 or 44.
So he taught,
Uncle Leon, wait a minute, because you need to use the mic.
Leon.
Just an aside, for utility purposes, in addition to the big fancy cars, my father had a car called a Willys, which was a small car. But because there was a big gasoline shortage in World War II and gasoline was rationed, he couldn't take out any of the big cars. So he would fit 7 or 8 people in the Willys. And in the back seat, we would bring in little baby chairs, and we would sit on the baby chairs. It was like that act you see in the circus where 100 clowns come out of a car. And that's what happened when we would pull up and come out.
Just for clarification, Willys was the company that made the Jeep. That's right, Willys. Exactly. Very perceptive.
Yeah. And so just getting back, can you describe the Duesenberg? Because that would be a very impressive car these days.
Yes.
The Duesenberg was a town car that we had. He had, at the time I remember, he had the Duesenberg and we had a Pierce Arrow coupe. But the Duesenberg was the one the family used because it had jump seats. That means seats you could pull out so you could put 5 people comfortably in the back of the car. My father, though he didn't drive, never sat anywhere but in the right side of the driver. That was his seat. And the rest of us all were in the back, so we were 6 in the family, so it worked out very well. My mother and my sister and myself usually would sit in the back, and the twins would sit on the jump seat, or some variety of that arrangement. The Duesenberg was a great gas burner, so as Jack just said, we got the Willys because it was a less gas-using car. And we used to put those chairs in the back, so we still had the same arrangement, 5 in the back and 1 in the front, plus the driver. When my father gave up the cars, he had, among other things, he had some financial reverses. He gave the car to Harry, and Harry used it, I guess, whatever. No, the Willys. The Duesenberg sat in our garage for the entire war And after the war, he sold it to H. Santa Coloma, was a garage guy who he used in Washington Heights. And that car was sold at that time for $450. Now, it wasn't in immaculate condition, but today they sell for well over $1 million or $2 or $3 or whatever they can get for if they're fixed up well. Anyway,
The properties he owned would have appreciated as well.
I guess they would have. Yeah. So he had but let's talk more about the things that he did in the community. My father was very involved in his community, and he started the Young Israel of Fremont as a member of the Bronx Jewish Center, which was a shul in the Bronx where he lived before he was married. And he was always involved in a shul or an organization. The Young Israel was the organization that he spent most of his time with. He was in the National Council. He was the controller of the entire organization. For years, I used to go occasionally to a convention with him. He was very involved in Young Israel his entire life. And in their 100th anniversary commemorative issue of The Viewpoint, their magazine, they had a picture of him with a quote that he talked about the Young Israel underneath his picture. It was very nice. And some of his very good best friends, closest friends, were the men that he worked with in the Young Israel.
Yeah, so another question from the audience. So you guys make sure that we get together as cousins at least once a year. Did you get together with your cousins all the time?
Many of our cousins lived within walking distance of our home. So we would very often, on Shabbos, I would walk to my cousin Hannah. That was my mother's brother's daughter. She lived like 2 blocks from us up until the time we were about 13. And I would go there on Shabbos afternoon. And my father's sisters lived maybe another 4 blocks away from us. And we would very often go to visit them. My Uncle Doc used to come every Friday, Shabbos afternoon, for tea and whatever. After my father died, his sister Gertie used to come almost every Shabbos because my mother was lonesome, so Gertie would walk over with her kids or herself on Shabbos afternoon. We had other aunts and uncles who weren't quite so close, but we had 3 or 4 who were within walking distance of us. Do we have an official get-together like this for the whole family?
Great-grandma's birthday. Grandma Levine's birthday used to be in Aunt Dora's house.
Oh, right.
We used to have a birthday party in February for my grandmother, who was Grandma's mother, Yetta Levinas. And we would gather in Uncle Doc's house, usually in Aunt Dora's house, and the family would come there for a birthday party for her. And besides that, the Simchas we had family weddings and bar mitzvahs and stuff going on, so the family did get together. In addition, by the way, to what Benita mentioned, I had my 2 cousins, Mark and Arthur, the 2 boys that were just a little senior to me, that lived about a block away. So not on Loring Place, and not only did we all, many of us live in the same area like this, but many of them belong to the same shul. So my Uncle Joe and my Uncle Mitchell and my father, we all belong to the Hebrew Institute, so we saw them on a regular basis on Shabbos.
I remember there was one time we had for some reason we had a party at the home of one of our aunts, my father's sisters, and we had another aunt, another one of my father's sisters, his sister Miriam, who very rarely came to parties because they had a candy store in Broadway, in what would now be called Inwood. And the store was open Sundays. So if there was a party, they couldn't close the store just for the party. But we remembered at one party, and it might have been for Hanukkah, World War II was finally over, and there was no longer rationing of sugar. And so bubble gum came back on the market. And Aunt Miriam sent for each child a piece of bubble gum, which hadn't been seen since the beginning of World War II. and we all were very excited to have bubble gum, and we tried to make it last several days. Now, as it happens, and I bring this up because my Aunt Miriam, she was married to somebody by the name of Weller, and I'm very friendly with Weller's nephew, Lenny Weller. And Mr. Weller, Lenny's father, lived for a very long time. And Jack used to go visit to him in the Moshe Zakanim in Riverdale. And when Mr. Sam Weller saw Jack, he'd say, "I know what you want to know. You want to know how old was your father? Your father was 5 years older than I am, but I don't know how when I was born."
And he finally admitted to me that my father was only 2 years older than him, but he was between 100 and 104 years old. He said, "College boy, you do the math." I did the math, and I discovered at a minimum, my father died 5 years later than he was on his death certificate. So I called up my brothers and my sisters. I have good news. Dad wasn't 55 when he died. He was 59 or 60. So we all felt we had our lives extended by 5 years. The only person who was upset was my mother. She says, "He lied to me again."
So I've heard my dad tell a story about, I have one now, of your dad taking you guys to a baseball game.
Oh, yes.
Is there anybody here who doesn't know the story? Really? Everyone's heard it? Okay.
No, I haven't.
Wait, why don't you want to let Jack or Benita tell it?
Well, actually, I think my father took us to a Boston Red Sox, New York Yankees
All right, you're
doubleheader.
already wrong.
Wasn't it Red Sox? It was a doubleheader, though, I think.
So this was after the Second World War, and the ball players who had been in the Army came back to play, again, Major League Baseball, including the famous Jewish ball player Hank Greenberg. Now, this particular Sunday doubleheader was against the Detroit Tigers and the Yankees, and Hank Greenberg was going to be playing. So my father took us to Yankee Stadium to see Hank Greenberg, and for him to see Hank Greenberg also. Now, it happens...
Was this when the Tigers were still in New York?
No, the Tigers were never in it. It was Detroit. The Yankees.
I'm mixing them up with the Giants.
Yes, the Giants. It was a Yankee game. Anyhow, so it also was my mother's birthday, so he took us, the four of us, to the Yankee Stadium. My mother had the day off. She didn't go to the game. So we had seats. And the Yankee Stadium was a triple-tier stadium at that time, and we had the seats in the middle tier. And so we were fairly close to the field, but when the ball was hit up high, it sort of disappeared when it went higher than the ceiling above us. But they were good seats, and of course we saw Greenberg play. So my father would sometimes get up and leave us there and go out and come back.
Because he didn't know anything about baseball.
He didn't know anything about baseball except Hank Greenberg. You know, everybody knew who Hank Greenberg was. So he gets up and goes out, comes back. We watch a little more. He gets up, goes out, comes back. And one time he doesn't come back for a long time. So we were very concerned about that. Where's Dad? Here's the four of us sitting there. We don't know how to get home, anything, you know. So finally, he does come back, and he sits down, and he's very quiet. He's very quiet, and uncharacteristically quiet. Doesn't say anything to us. The game ends, the second game ends, and we go home. We find out later, what happened, Dad? Why were you gone so long, you know? And I was arrested. What? What do you mean you were arrested? He said, well, a cop came over to me, and he said, I'm taking you in for taking bets on the game. I said, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? What precinct are you in? He said, I'm in the, whatever the precinct was. He says, I know you're captain. I'm going to have you taken care of. I have here with my 4 kids, and I have to get back to them. So why, leave me alone. I have nothing to do with gambling. What are you talking about? He said, I watched you. You're going out, you're making phone calls, you're going back, you're making more phone calls. I see you're taking bets. So my father said, look, I have to get back to my kids, and I don't like this, and I'm going to put give me your name, give me your badge number. So he comes back, and he says to the cop, He says to the cop, "Why did you pick me of all the people in the stadium? Why did you pick on me?" He said, "Because you kept walking out at the most exciting parts of the game."
So that leads me to, you are a very amazing speaker. Uncle Jack is incredible. I've heard him just stand up without any preparation, and he speaks incredibly. Were either of your parents have a public presence?
My father.
Did you hear him speak at this?
Yes. We heard.
Feel free to expand on any of your answers. Yes, it's just, not teaching us anything.
Yeah, we heard him speak in shul. We heard him make appeals in shul. In Rabbi Domestic, I will show him his shul. We heard him speak on occasion at
Birthday party.
I remember very well when he spoke at their 25th anniversary party. I remember his speech, how he said that whatever happened to him, he said he had good times and he had less good times, and he said, but everything that happened to him, he couldn't have not have done anything without the support of my mother. It was a very moving speech that he made for her at that time, and that was a big party that sometimes I've showed you the slides, and it was in a hotel. We had 25th anniversary, and even Trudy was there. We already had known each other. So he did speak, and he wrote, and I guess I'm sure he spoke a lot when he was in the Young Israel things. And by the way, Grandma, who never would speak, if you all recall, some of you will recall, that on her 85th birthday, when we got her to finally go up to speak, she didn't want to stop. She liked it, and she did it again in her 90th.
I don't think any of us was surprised about that.
My father was very much a people person. Everybody loved him. He was greeted and was friendly with everybody and anybody, something like Toddy. He could speak, as they said, very well about any topic. I'm not exactly sure. He said he had a college degree. They used to call him doctor, as a doctor, PhD. I suspect he was in some kind of joint program with the Jewish Theological Seminary, and maybe he never finished, because we never saw a college degree from City College or from Columbia or from the JTS. But he wrote beautifully for a man who spent his formative years speaking another language. If you ever see any of the things that he wrote elegantly and beautifully. The story is that when he was at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Mordecai Kaplan was his instructor, and my father got up and said to Mordecai Kaplan, "You're an Apikeris," and he thought he was going to be kicked out of school, but somehow he managed to smooth it over, and Mordecai Kaplan at one point was his tenant in one of his buildings. But he was the person who could make peace. He was the person who was the life of the party.
This is Charlie Gross, by the way. I'm sorry?
I want to add one thing. An example of that I remember very well. There was a man in our shul in the Hebrew Institute. His name was Reb David Toren. He was a very learned man. He was a real Talmid Chacham. And one day we're walking, and there's a lesson I learned from my father, I guess, on this day. We were walking to a different shul, and Reb David was on the other side of the street. My father took us and crossed the street and went over to say good Shabbos and speak to the Reb David for a moment or two, and then we went back and continued on to shul. I said, "Dad, why did you cross the street to see this man, to say good Shabbos?" He said, "Because he's a very learned man." And that was a good lesson for us, I think, at that time.
Okay, hold on. This is a great-grandchild speaking here, Miriam.
Well, grandchild of Benita. So my question, why did your dad keep leaving the baseball game?
My father, what he knew about the baseball game before we went to that game was the Chicago Black Sox. And all he knew was that Chicago had dumped the game the World Series in 1919. So as far as my father was concerned, baseball was crooked. In fact, the second game our father took us to was the 1947 World Series game between the Dodgers and the Yankees, and it was the sixth game. He didn't take us to the game, he took us to the stadium so we could stand on line behind 18,000 other people. He was absolutely amazed that there were 18,000 people already online to see this fakakta game that didn't to sit in the bleachers. But he was very impressed that there were other 18,000 nudniks already in front of us. And that game got played during Sukkot, and it was one of the longest World Series games ever played. Erev Sukkot. And we suddenly discovered when the game was over, it was pitch black. So we had a moral dilemma. Do we take the subway home or walk home? We decided to walk home, and we got home at 9:30, and my father was sitting, drumming his fingers on the dining room table, waiting for dinner, and for his three sons to show up. And he chewed us out very badly, and then he said, and by the way, did the Yankees win? And we said, no, they lost. And he says, God punished you.
So my father's been...
Question, what he was doing. What was he making the phone call?
Oh, he was always trying to make a deal with somebody. He was calling some...
No. I think it's a little simpler than that. Sometimes people don't pay the rent. And he was calling the people, he had a list of people's names and numbers with dollar signs. And he was calling these delinquent tenants and putting some pressure on them to pay up. And that's what made the cops so suspicious. Here's a guy with phone call, people's names, papers, and dollar signs next to them. You know, it sounded like he could be a gambler.
Wait, okay, hold the microphone for a minute. So the story that Uncle Jack just told, my father sat here and shook his head no the entire time. What's your memory of it?
What I just told you.
No, not that. The Erev Sukkot story.
Erev Sukkot story, I have to say something very nice about your father.
Yeah?
He took us. He was in charge. No. First of all, look.
You threw him under the bus.
He was the person responsible for us while we were at the... My father didn't go into the stadium. He might have taken us to the stadium, to the line. Toddy was then the person in charge. And he did a very good job of being a big brother, keeping an eye on us. And he brought our boys back from the Yankee Stadium.
And we didn't eat the salami sandwiches at 11 a.m., right?
Who are they playing?
So, I have a question. Toddy?
Say it again.
Give him the microphone. Give him the
What was
microphone.
your memory of your father? Why was he calling? What do you think it was?
I have a question. This is Charlie Gross. I have a question for Uncle Toddy about your time in the Air Force. And can you confirm or deny the fact that you never flew in the Air Force because Grandma would not let you?
I never flew while I was in the Air Force. It had nothing to do with Grandma.
So...
Explain.
What's to explain? One...
Did you not fly in the
Oh, there was never a necessity for me to go into an airplane. The highest I ever got off the ground, as I've told before, is when I went to sleep at night.
Aunt Fran wants a story from the audience.
I want everyone to hear this story because it is hysterical. Grandpa was thrown out of a yeshiva, and the rest of the story is brilliant. Jack, you want to tell it?
At one time, my father owned 418 Central Park West, right?
Well, that would be nice.
It still exists, it's still there. We don't own it anymore. And
I think that leads to Beth's question. Where is Beth? Isn't your question, where's the family fortune? But go ahead.
he had a rental agent. And he had his office in that building. And one day the rental agent says, Mr. Levine, one of your people is here, he wants to rent an apartment, and he has no references. He says he's been out of the country for the last 3 years in Palestine. You ought to talk to him. I think it was Mordecai Kaplan who had thrown him. It was Mordecai Kaplan. And he comes in, my father recognizes him instantly, and the guy says, listen, I need an apartment. I'm teaching at the Jewish Theological Seminary. I've been out of the country for 3 years, but nobody believes me. They think I'm a deadbeat. What do you think? He says, well, what I think is 25 years ago, you threw me out of the Jewish Theological Seminary. You said I've never amounted to anything, and I own this building. Now, out of the goodness of my heart, I'll rent you an apartment. Yeah.
Okay, does anybody have a question that they want to ask? Where is Josh?
I have a question.
Or Noah? Oh, Noah's davening.
This is a quick one. What was your father's name and your grandparents' name?
In which country?
Both countries.
Okay. Grandpa Charles was Petzalel in Poland, in Piesk, where Aunt Fran and I actually visited it a couple of years ago. Okay? And when they came to the United States, let's see, what was their name? Sklarowski. Now, between 1912 and 1914, my grandfather Levine changed his name from Sklarowski to Levine.
Why?
The reason most people changed their names in those times is because they were in trouble with somebody. So they changed their name.
Who was he in trouble with?
I never found out, but his brother, Abraham Sklar, was always very upset that my father had changed his name to Levine. For two reasons, because he gave up the name Sklar, or Sklarowski, and the second thing is, we're not Levites, we're Yisroels. Uncle Toddy and I can go to any shul in the country on a Monday, Thursday, or Shabbos, and we're off at the second Aliyah. And we can't take it because we're Levines, but we're not Levites.
That's why I said, does anybody in the audience have a question?
Twins both ended up at Bronx Science.
I just heard that question. I didn't even know that you went to Bronx Science.
What do you expect? I'm a scientist.
Sure.
And Benita went to Bronx Science too.
That's right. And she's a grandma.
I have to tell the truth. I did not pass the exam. I did well enough to go to Stuyvesant. But my mother didn't want to have two different schedules and two different lunches to make. So she used some influence to get me admitted.
Wait, isn't Stuyvesant better?
Not in those days.
At that time, science was the school. Today it's Stuyvesant, but when we went, science was the school to get into. Coincidentally,
Thank you, Benita.
eight Nobel Prize winners.
And Robin Hood synthesizers in the right place.
So, another question we have is, the Levines, my family, waited 4 hours between meat and milk. Who made that up? Because I've never met anyone else who people wait 3, people wait 6. No one's ever heard of 4 besides us. You've heard of it, yeah, but you were his brother.
Give him the mic.
Okay, I believe it was a practical invention of Grandma Florrie.
Okay.
Because we'd come home from school, we'd have 2 or 3 glasses of milk, maybe a quart, okay, and we'd be filled with milk.
I can ask him to come up.
And of course, there was no restriction about when you could eat meat after milk, but my mother liked the hour 4 hours. She thought that was a good time between meals. You could work off the old dinner and you could start all over again. So I think Grandma Florrie came up with the 4 hours. It may have been a Levitas trait also.
I think Charles has a question.
Yeah, when you eat meat for lunch, you would have, and it would get dark, they would eat before it got dark. So then they'd eat the supper. There's like a commentary, one of the things, so that was where the 4 hours may have come from. Dad, you going to Milka? Okay, I have a quick question while you're here. Where were you guys born? How did you meet your spouse? And where were you married?
We know for a fact, because it's recorded on our birth certificates, that myself and all my siblings were born in the Bronx.
No?
No?
Queens. Toddy was in Queens. No. Beth Israel Hospital in Lower Manhattan. What? Toddy was born in Beth Israel Hospital.
Beth Israel in like Pine Street or something.
Well,
Someone was born in Queens.
No?
No.
There was a story Grandma told me about so the doctor having to come up, and the regular doctor got there and said, and the two were conversing, and the doctor said to Grandma, it's a good thing I was here because the baby was strangling on its umbilical cord. And Grandma had heard the doctors talking in Latin, and one said to the other, how to go fine, no complications, and Grandma knew Latin, and she never used that doctor again.
That was Uncle Toddy, and it was, I think the head was crowning, and the doctor wasn't there.
But that wasn't in Queens? That was in the Bronx? Okay, well, you learned something, sorry?
Some of us did.
Into the mic, Josh, into the mic.
Some of us did, yeah. Yeah, we, Jack and I were born in the Bronx, in Bronx Hospital.
Bronx Hospital.
I was also born in a place called Bronx Hospital in the Bronx.
Bronx Hospital is around Jackson Street, something like that.
No idea.
Where you also?
I have a question for you guys.
Wait, okay, while you're here, I wanted to say where they met their spouse.
Okay, let them finish that story. I want to ask them.
So I met, this is getting a little long, I met Uncle Murray on a weekend at the Pioneer Country Club in the Catskills, and we got married at the Croydon Hotel in Manhattan.
But you forgot to tell them you forgot to tell them that somebody had tried to set you up with Murray before, and that Murray had said you were too far away because he lived in the Queens and you lived in Bronx. He lived in Brooklyn and you lived in the Bronx, but then he met you and it was Bashir. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
I met Aunt Fran on a blind date on September 3rd, and she lived in the Bronx, which made it very easy to meet her.
In 1957, I went to work at Camp Ramon, Wisconsin, and over that summer I met Sybil, and the rest is history.
Toddy went to Midian, but he met Trudy at camp. Right, and he said she's really nice, but she's a little naive or something like that. And she was very young, but the rest is history, as they say.
Okay,
They were married at the Burnside Manor in the Bronx.
I think, do we have any more questions? Otherwise, I think we're going to wrap this up.
I have one question for them. Grandma told me a story about a redheaded shaliach coming to the house, and that redheaded shaliach having because of that shaliach, she decided that she was going to marry a man from the old country. Had anybody else heard that story? Grandma told me that story when Sarah was a newborn.
We have reason to believe that may have been one of Margie's relatives.
And that was my grandfather, and the shaliach was from
Tel's Yeshiva.
Tel's Yeshiva.
My grandparents were big supporters of Tel's Yeshiva.
And my father came at that time as a shaliach and my grandfather was a Rata.
All right.
So it's a really small world.
That's true.